Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Lee Pfeffer, and I am the Manager of Museum Experience at the GLBT Historical Society, and I thank you for joining us tonight. I want to start by acknowledging that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. This event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. And if you're watching live, we welcome your active participation in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for the participants. Before I turn it over to tonight's speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about what the Society is and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, or GLBT Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 2011, and the Dr. John P. DiCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. Please check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources online at glbthistory.org. And finally, I would like to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, I invite you to consider joining us today. Members get a variety of perks, including a 20% discount on swag from the store, both online and in the museum itself, and get access to special members-only events, and you also get access to events like this for free. You also get free access to the museum for yourself and a guest. You can learn more about how to become a member and other ways that you can give and support the society by going to glbthistory.org/join-give. And now I want to introduce you a little bit about the program that we have tonight and our wonderful speakers. So we have two historians here with us this evening who are going to discuss the long and interwoven history of LGBTQ and labor activism through the lens of a brand new book by one of our speakers, Allison Brantley, called Brewing a Boycott: How a Grassroots Coalition Fought Coors and Remade American Consumer Activism. So we are going to welcome on our two speakers. We're going to start off with Alison Brantley. She is an assistant professor of history at the University of Laverne. She studies, teaches, and writes about social movements and radical coalitions in the late 20th century United States. She received her PhD from Yale University in 2016, and she's a 2020 to 2021 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader. She currently lives in Los Angeles, and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Pacific Historical Review, and the Radical History Review. So we'll bring on Allison right here. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Lee. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and I'm really excited to introduce everyone to your book and to your work, and to be able to facilitate a conversation with Miriam Frank, who is our other guest for this evening. I'm going to tell you all a little bit about Miriam, and we'll bring her on and just say hi, and then I'll hand the stage off to you. So we are also welcoming Miriam Frank, who began her academic career in Detroit during the 1970s as a professor of women's studies at Wayne County Community College. Via museum tours and after-work reading circles at union halls, she went on to develop community programs sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities that emphasized the great artistic, literary, and cinematic cultures of Detroit's historic working-class communities. During the mid-1980s and for the next 35 years, Dr. Frank taught humanities in New York University's Liberal Studies program, and in 1995, she began research on Out in the Union, A Labor History of Queer America, a history of collaboration between two vital movements in the 20th century, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. So let's bring on Miriam. Hi, Miriam.
How do you do?
Hello. Thank you so much for welcoming us Welcome, or thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's so great to be able to have a conversation between the two of you, and to be able to look at one of the newest pieces of scholarship, and one of the most comprehensive pieces of scholarship on this topic. So I'm really excited to get into things, and I am so grateful for both of you for being here. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to be having Allison and Miriam both speak this evening, and we will have a section near the end for you to ask questions or make any comments, observations. Please feel free to use that chat, and please feel free to put things in as we're going through the evening. And then when we do our Q&A, we will pull it on up and do a question and answer. So I'm going to hand it over to Allison, and I will see you all on the other side shortly.
Thank you, Lee. Great. Hi, everybody. Good evening. First of all, I want to say again, thanks to Lee and everybody at the GLBT Historical Society for putting this on and helping to bring us together. And of course, many thanks to Miriam Frank for joining us this evening. And also many thanks to those of you in the audience for being with us tonight, or maybe even watching after the fact. And actually, I'd welcome you to say hello in the comments so we can see who you are and where you're coming from, if you feel like you'd like to do that. Either way, and regardless, it's a privilege to be with you all to chat more about histories of resistance, consumer activism, and in particular, collaborative intersectional organizing in and among and between LGBTQ and labor circles. And as Lee mentioned at the top, I'm going to explore those themes through the lens of the long-running boycott of Coors beer. And this was and is a movement that's really near and dear to me. It's the subject of my recent book, for example. And I grew up in Colorado, where Coors sort of looms large, but maybe the boycott less so. And so I'm excited to share more about this story. What I'll do tonight, hi everybody, I see your comments, thank you. I will provide an overview of the contours and history of the Coors boycott, with special attention to LGBTQ and labor alliances within it. I'll read a short excerpt from the book itself, and then I'll discuss some items from the GLBT Historical Society's archival collections that really helped me to tell this story. So to get us started, and broadly speaking, when I think about the Coors boycott movement, I think about less a cohesive single movement than a series of intersecting and overlapping boycott episodes that kind of cascade one over the other from the late 1950s to the 1990s, and maybe even into the present. And in this time, over the course of 4 decades or more, a diverse array of activists targeted the Coors Brewing Company, which was based in Colorado, as well as the Coors family for, really, if we boil it down to it, 3 separate reasons. First, allegations of anti-unionism at the Coors Brewery and in Coors's broader operations across the region. Second, allegations and experiences of discrimination in hiring at Coors. And third, for the far-right conservative politics of the Coors family. And that third piece ends up being kind of the most prominent as the boycott develops. But all of these different threads sort of come together at different moments to create a movement that is really robust, it's long-lasting, and it brings together lots of different folks. So the boycott, as far as I can tell, or what I found in my research for the book, initially began in 1957 at Coors's flagship brewery in Golden, Colorado. It's just a little bit outside of Denver. And in 1957, the local union of brewery workers, mostly working in maintenance and production on the brewery floor, went on strike against the company. Tensions had been mounting, particularly over wages and working conditions. And so they went on strike, and they also called for a consumer boycott of the beer. And the boycott was really meant to be the sort of extra pressure on Coors's pocketbook. And actually, the boycott and the strike ended up working, pushing the company to the table, and the strike ended, and the union settled with the company. Even so, in 1957, there's sort of this growing language about boycotting Coors and also pointing at the anti-unionism of the company. It's clear even in 1957 that the company really would rather not have to deal with a union. And over time, the company and their representatives do a lot of different things that really smack of anti-unionism and union busting, even though they maybe say that that's not what they're doing. And so this initial boycott sort of sets a foundation, especially around an argument that the company is anti-labor. Over the next decade into the 1960s, Mexican Americans who were increasingly describing themselves as Chicanos in Colorado launched their own boycott effort, largely because of experiences of discrimination at the brewery, which sort of came from outright allegations of discrimination, experiences that people of color in Colorado had trying to apply for jobs and not getting them. And in fact, the company really only hired people of color through an ex-felon pipeline and then sort of shuttled those people into unskilled labor at the brewery. There was also data that backed up these allegations because the company had to report to the federal government. And it became clear to Chicano activists that the company was not hiring people of color or women at parity with the local population. Furthermore, activists noted that the company and its management was really trying to curate its workforce. One way they did this, well, a couple of ways they did this was through surveillance, as well as pretty aggressive use of pre-employment polygraph tests or lie detector tests. And I'll come back to those later, but all of these things combine to give rise to a boycott that's also really focused on discrimination at the brewery and basically saying the company is, sometimes they would say the company is racist, they would say that the company discriminates, and that was reason also to boycott. And that brought Chicanos, Black activists, and other people of color into the movement as well, although they weren't always seeing eye to eye with the labor movement. And then the boycott continued into the 1970s and 1980s and really beyond. The public political actions of members of the Coors family, especially Joseph or Joe Coors, led many others to join the boycott. They were particularly incensed and frustrated with Coors' generous funding of and associations with far-right conservative organizations. To name a few, Joe Coors provided some of the seed funding for the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. He was very closely associated with the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, which sought to oust progressive lawmakers. He was very closely aligned with Ronald Reagan, supporting him in his 1976 run for president, and then his successful bid in 1980. And the Coors family was always seen to be very close with the Reagan administration. And so for progressive activists from the 1960s to the 1980s, the name on the can of beer was increasingly associated with the name of a man who was a key player in building up the conservative movement, and a movement which sought to roll back a lot of the wins and progressive strategies of the civil rights movement and activist movements of this period. And so that brought a lot of people in from across the country who decided to boycott Coors because of the politics of it all. Now, while the boycott began in Colorado, it soon expanded. And for those of you coming from all over the country, you probably knew that the boycott came to your city. The boycott expanded to follow Coors' distribution and markets. It also expanded because activist networks were all across the country. And it also expanded to match Coors' growing political notoriety. So it first expanded in the American West and then moved eastward into the 1980s. And I see this really as an expansion that is both geographic and demographic. So the boycott moves into other cities and brings more and more folks and communities and organizations into it. And it's a movement in which the three narratives or arguments about Coors' anti-unionism, discrimination, and politics fused to create a movement that was about much more than beer and about much more than the red name emblazoned on the side of a silver can. Now, expansion and coalition building in this boycott movement occurred during particular moments of strife or tension, especially for people involved in the labor movement. And because of these sort of moments of tension or moments of urgency, the boycott would expand and bring more people in. And some of these key moments where the coalition really grows are some that I detail in the second half of my book, most notably from 1973 to 1976 in San Francisco and the Bay Area, where Teamsters, activists of color, and LGBTQ activists like Howard Wallace and Harvey Milk played essential roles. That brought people together, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The boycott expanded also because of a protracted strike at the flagship brewery in Golden from 1977 to 1978. So the Union of Brewery Workers went on strike yet again in 1977 and immediately called for a boycott and sent strikers all across the American West to build little boycott coalitions in cities to support strikers through boycott actions, food drives, and other forms of outreach. I should note that that strike in 1978 ended in a disappointment. The company decertified or busted the union. And after that strike ended, there was actually a lot of anger against Coors, particularly for its anti-unionism. And this, in fact, kept the boycott going well into the 1980s. As many of you might know, the boycott thrived especially in urban areas. Places where the boycott coalitions were strongest were places where coalitional activism and networks were really thriving in many different ways. San Francisco is, of course, a key place. Denver, Austin, Albuquerque, Chicago, Boston, and New York were all hubs of boycott organizing, where civil rights and labor organizations organized boycott actions large and small, and worked intentionally to build diverse coalitions. And they used the many reasons that Coors offended people to join hands with other communities. As I think the Boston Globe put it in the 1980s, like if you were on the left, Coors offended you, and could pick any one of many reasons to boycott Coors. Of course, that's not a great paraphrase, but basically Coors offended so many people that it was pretty natural for a lot of folks to join the boycott, and not just individually boycott, but join a bigger movement. And so over the life of the boycott, representatives of the labor movement, LGBTQ organizations, Chicano and Latinx activists, Black activists, feminists, student activists, Native American and Red Power activists, I have to breathe, the list goes on so long, and environmentalists joined and amplified the boycott call. And for them, this was really a longstanding and heroic fight for working people at Coors on the one hand, and against conservative forces, broadly speaking. Now, it's worth noting, however, that by the 1980s, the Coors Brewing Company became more and more adept at combating a lot of this boycott activity. For a while, they kind of scoffed at it. They thought it was silly or unimportant or just a bunch of wackos, basically, I think is how they put it at some point. But over time, they realized that the boycott was cutting their sales in many key markets like San Francisco. And so community relations folks and other managers at Coors engaged in a lot of work to do segmented and directed outreach to boycott communities, to assuage boycotters and say, you know, you say we're bad, but we've changed. Here's a lot of money to show you that we really mean that we're committed to LGBTQ rights or Black rights. And so the company did gradually pull some communities and organizations away from the boycott because of these concerted efforts. They would do things like general funding of organizations, scholarships for students, directed advertising. You know, in the case of LGBTQ communities, they advertised in The Advocate, which was, you know, a big deal for a company of this size. They also improved their hiring practices and did away with some of their discriminatory practices from the past. And so this weakened and led to an official end of the boycott in 1987. Even so, many folks remained committed to their boycott activism, and in particular, LGBTQ activists kept the flame going into the 1990s. For me, a key thread in this history, and its long and intersecting and complex permutations, a key thread, especially from the 1970s onward, is the involvement and leadership of LGBTQ activists. Sometimes they were engaging in intentional coalition with the labor movement, and sometimes they were really taking the lead and pushing the movement forward. So it's worth spending some time here to kind of center those experiences and that organizing. So LGBTQ activists, organizations, and consumers got involved in the boycott for 3 different and kind of overlapping reasons. First, there was considerable opposition to and outrage about the company's use of polygraph tests, which I mentioned before. According to affidavits from brewery workers, the polygraph test included questions about sexuality and intimate histories. So if you had applied for a job at Coors, you would go through a long questionnaire, and then you'd be sent to a third-party polygraph test company or administrator. And many people noted that these questions made them the most uncomfortable out of an array of sort of questionable questions. It's worth noting that many brewery workers had never been asked questions like that. I think for many straight, male, cis brewery workers, they'd never been assumed to have any sort of deviant sexual behavior, and so the polygraph test really upset them. And so this was actually a key piece of boycott organizing, was to say, hey, the company is discriminatory, it does these polygraph tests. And for LGBTQ activists, this was also a point of contention, and it was kind of one of the first narratives that really brought people in. Now, beyond this, there was significant opposition to the family's political and financial links to anti-gay, pro-family, pro-life, I guess, figures and organizations. Some of the family's foundations supported the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell, Pat Buchanan, even the Reagan administration. So for a lot of queer activists, the political ties of the family to anti-gay causes were really motivating to get them to boycott. As they said, like, you don't want to use your money to fund something that's going to come back around and hurt you. And then third, I would emphasize that LGBTQ activists saw a real symbolic or expressive value of solidarity with other members of the boycott coalition. Many activists, saw the boycott as something that encompassed their diverse views, right? It brought together working class arguments, environmentalist concerns, as well as political concerns. Now, for others like Harvey Milk, he believed that solidarity with the labor movement had a real sort of instrumental purpose, that it would reap rewards for the LGBTQ community, both politically and economically. If we help them in their boycott, they will help us. And indeed they did in the fight against the Briggs Initiative in California. So from Harvey Milk to Howard Wallace and Bayard Rustin, LGBTQ activists and leaders helped to amplify and radicalize boycott calls. And importantly, they pushed moderate, straight, white allies to do more than offer empty promises of solidarity or sort of performative coalition by just putting a name on a list. So it's really important that these organizations and queer activists are involved, because they're pushing the boycott towards a more inclusive and, I think, radical space. But on the flip side, this activism caught Coors' attention. Slowly but surely, the company began to do its own outreach to LGBTQ consumers and recognized the power and the wealth of the gay consumer market. As a result, and maybe we can see this as a success of the boycott, the company arguably became one of the most progressive companies in terms of hiring and supporting LGBTQ employees, and they funded an array of gay and lesbian organizations, and including, pride events, AIDS walks, and AIDS research by the 1990s. Some activists would say, well, that's disingenuous, they're just trying to buy us out. But they are sort of tangible successes that we can see happening from their involvement in this boycott movement. Okay, so I've provided an overview of the boycott. Hopefully I've sort of centered the activism of LGBTQ activists, which really, I believe, drove the boycott forward and made it last as long as it did. But I've been speaking at kind of a general level. So to provide a sense of what this looked like on the ground, I'd like to read a short bit from chapter 4 of the book, which focuses on the mid-1970s boycott in San Francisco and Teamsters, LGBTQ, Latinx alliances. And I'm gonna, Lee, if we could pull up the slides. Yeah, so I'm sharing a picture. It's one of the few pictures I have that's good enough to put up, but Howard Wallace is a key player in this boycott. He's on the left. I think this photo is from the 1980s. He's with Lane Kirkland, a labor leader, and Dave Sickler, a boycott coordinator for the AFL-CIO. And so I want to start with a story about him and somebody else who I'll introduce in a second. So this is an excerpt from chapter 4, which is entitled Everyone's Fight, Boycotting in the Bay Area, 1973 to 1976. Howard Wallace, quote, a tall, lean white guy, kind of handsome, end quote, was notoriously loud on a picket line and ubiquitous in San Francisco's leftist circles in the 1970s. Even if you could not see him, Wallace himself joked, you could hear him. A transplant from Denver, Wallace had moved to Northern California in 1967, bringing with him a robust track record of activism that he'd cultivated in union meetings and gatherings of the Socialist Workers' Party, as well as in the direct organizing efforts of other groups he'd co-founded, such as the Committee Against Police Brutality and Denver's Stop the War Committee. Yet in his first few years in San Francisco, Wallace was lonely, searching for meaningful work, activism, and community. Making himself useful in anti-war protests and other organizations on the left, he also struggled with the secret of his sexuality, finally coming out in the early 1970s, when he was in his 30s. He did so out of frustration with the homophobia of the New Left, particularly the efforts of the National Organization for Women to silence or expel lesbians from its ranks. Wallace thus linked his leftist activism with the burgeoning gay liberation movement, stumbling, as he put it, quote, willy-nilly into a situation where I had a certain uniqueness, end quote. He was a skilled organizer, committed socialist and feminist, loud protester, and eager new member of the movement for gay and lesbian liberation. As he found his footing in this unique situation, Wallace also stumbled into the boycott of Coors beer. Lee, if you wouldn't mind changing the slide. Thank you. It happened in 1974 at 18th and Castro in San Francisco's Eureka Valley neighborhood. Members of Local 888 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, IBT, the regional union of beer delivery men, were picketing a local store, urging passersby and consumers not to buy Coors beer. Leaflets and picket signs noted that Coors was, quote, unfair to Local 888, which had been on strike for over a year against intransigent anti-union distributors of the Colorado beer. Wallace, who knew about the beer and the conservative Coors family from his days in Colorado, immediately struck up a conversation with Alan Baird, a longtime Eureka Valley resident, newspaper delivery driver, and lead boycott organizer. Wallace took some leaflets from Baird to pass out in his own gay leftist circles. Soon afterward, Wallace asked a favor of Baird. Would he and some Teamsters join a picket in support of the United Farm Workers Grape Boycott? Baird happily agreed. On a picket line outside of a Safeway grocery store on the corner of Market and Dubose, Baird and Wallace leafleted and chanted, enjoining consumers to avoid scab grapes and Coors beer, and they began to form what would become a lifelong friendship and alliance. Wallace steadfastly committed himself to the Coors boycott, bringing the issue to gay leftists and urging them to stand in solidarity with strikers as they challenged the right wing and, as Wallace insisted, anti-gay Coors family. Baird made reciprocal commitments, working alongside Wallace and Harvey Milk, a local businessman in Politico, to fight for gay rights and bring openly gay men and women into the Teamsters Union. Wallace's friendship with Baird, born on a picket line, was part of a broader, vibrant process of coalition building around the Coors boycott in Northern California between 1973 and 1976. Connecting their labor, gay, and leftist networks, these two men were key bridge leaders in a regional effort to organize and sustain an anti-Coors movement. Baird's Teamsters, a blue-collar union of truck drivers, often panned as overwhelmingly white, conservative, or corrupt, and Wallace's contacts on the gay left, as well as radical Chicano, Native American, and Black activists, found common ground in their antagonism toward local Coors distributors, the Coors family, and the politics they embodied. Building on radical networks in the Bay Area, as well as earlier organizing that had generated the central narratives of Coors as anti-unionism, discrimination, and conservatism, activists in the Bay Area mounted a substantial challenge to Coors. Their coalitional work, though often tenuous, demonstrated that the anti-Coors issue was not a provincial one, limited only to specific aggrieved communities or even to Colorado, the epicenter of Coors' power. So this chance encounter, which I think helped to resuscitate a struggling Teamsters strike in 1973, 74, really gave rise to a boycott movement in San Francisco that continued for multiple decades and really made the city a sort of hub for LGBTQ and labor boycott organizing. It also became sort of the site of very real divisions over the boycott and its future as Coors made inroads into various communities. The collections at the GLBT Historical Society really helped me tell this story, and so I just want to end by spotlighting some things from their archives. They helped me tell the story from the era of this local 888 boycott to Coors' efforts to get its beer back in bars in the 1980s and 1990s. And I should say the image on the slide here is one of Alan Baird leafleting on the streets of San Francisco, and he's in a suit right beneath the Geary sign. You can see him there. So Lee, would you mind, or I can change the slide. Okay, so the great thing about the GLBT Historical Society's collections is there's a lot of ephemera from different social movements, and this is where I found a great deal of leaflets and bumper stickers and other kinds of items from the boycott itself in San Francisco. And one of the first things that struck me was I kept seeing leaflets that I knew came from somewhere else, at first mostly from Colorado, show up in San Francisco. And then I'd see them in other places. So these archives helped me really see the extent of these activist networks, that a leaflet about the polygraph or a leaflet about discrimination against Chicanos would make it to San Francisco and be in this particular archive really underscored the expansiveness of the boycott. And so we can actually see that in the image on the slide. I know some of these leaflets, you can't really read the text in this setting, and I apologize for that. But for example, this is an account of labor and LGBTQ alliances from 1978 from the San Francisco Gay Democratic Club. So it highlights the ongoing work of the boycott even after local 888 strike. A couple quotes from this that really stick out to me is one quote, "This boycott is the most graphic demonstration to date of gay economic power. 90% of San Francisco's gay bars no longer serve Coors, resulting in a sales loss estimated at 5,000 cases a week." And later it goes on to say, Supervisor Harvey Milk puts it like this, quote, "Would you drink a can of beer made by Hitler?" So what I like about this particular item and this particular leaflet is it shows, I think, the real symbolic and instrumental value of the boycott, and also some of the sort of more creative and sometimes incendiary language that activists used. We can see the boycott expanding out from San Francisco and also becoming a point of debate in the community. In this image here from 1977, this was a forum in Hollywood where I guess it's the League of Voters for Equal Rights, invited representatives from Coors, a guy named Bob Russo, and Harvey Milk to basically debate the Coors controversy before a wider audience. So we can also see Coors' efforts to kind of undercut the boycott here. They did this a lot. They'd go to debates, they'd do outreach. One person they often had do outreach in the 80s and 90s was Mary Cheney, for example. She was hired by Coors a little bit later than this. And so by the 1980s, the company and its distributors were more and more aggressive at pushing into boycott coalitions and trying to pull people out. And in fact, they were more successful at this. And the GLBT Historical Society has a great deal of items and sources that highlight some of these successes in both this collection that I'm spotlighting and the Tavern Guild collection. So there's another one here. And this one's, I know, not readable because I think it was photocopied probably 3 or 4 times before it made it into folders in the archives. But this is from May of 1983, and we can see the San Francisco Pool Association actually reaching out to Coors to get them to support an event. And this think underscores the real divisions and over the boycott and the realities of maybe Coors's desperation to end the boycott in the queer community. One quote here that's actually marked on the page as well is, "The anti-Coors sentiment among gays has begun to diminish over the past few months. And so we think it would be to our mutual advantage now in mid-1983 for the Coors company to subsidize a major gay sporting event." And I believe they did. I mean, Coors sponsored hundreds of different events. As one boycott organizer, Dave Sickler, put it, if you had two cockroaches racing, Coors would show up and try to sell t-shirts. The collections also include different pieces of ephemera that highlight the other side here, where queer boycotters and labor boycotters are really adamant about keeping the boycott going. Some good ones here from 1988, I think is sort of lambasting the idea that Coors could be for LGBTQ consumers. They sort of see this cognitive dissonance there, that the company could even do anything progressive. And another one here, I think from the early 1990s, that sort of reuses a Coors ad and asserts the extreme right beer still, which is a play on one of their slogans about it being the right beer for now, or something like that. I don't know if folks can remember. So what we can see is a boycott in San Francisco that is active, it's creative, it's often quite contentious, and actually boycott efforts and alliances between LGBTQ and labor activists continued on into the 1990s and kind of came full circle in service of coalitional activism. This is not from the collections, but I wanted to highlight this clipping from the Bay Area Reporter. This is an event in November 1998 where a number of LGBTQ activists were protesting GLAAD's decision to work with and accept money from Coors in 1998. And so they organized a dump out, which was a pretty common tactic in the movement, which Miriam will talk about, outside of Harvey's Bar in the Castro. And they invited Teamster Alan Baird to join them, sort of in honor of his relationship with Howard Wallace and his close friendship with Harvey Milk. And so you can see him here in this picture, kind of on the front right. And actually, as Tisok is saying in the comments, Alan Barrett is on the call tonight as well. So hello, Alan. Thank you so much for all of your work on this boycott. So this dump out in 1998, I think, underscores the persistence here of the boycott and the way that San Francisco is really this ongoing center of boycott activity and kind of helps to keep it afloat for really quite a long time. So this is a profoundly San Francisco story is sort of what I'm saying here, but it really is more than that. Boycott coalitions emerged and prevailed in cities across the country as Coors's distribution expanded, as the Coors name became more and more associated with right-wing politics, and as the movement just gained more and more momentum. Major boycott centers included Chicago, Detroit, Hartford, Boston, and New York City. And so I really see this as a complex, exciting, and national history of coalitional activism, coalitional anti-corporate activism. I was able to dive into this story with the help of the GLBT Historical Society, and I also want to shout out to the San Francisco Public Library's Hormel Center, helped me really tell this story, and crucially also the oral histories that Miriam Frank was able to do with folks like the late Howard Wallace. And so, I think this is my cue, this is my moment to pass it on to her so that she can, I think she's also going to talk about boycott activism outside of San Francisco so we can get sort of an even deeper and richer understanding of this boycott. And she can also talk about her own relationships with some of these people that I've highlighted. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to, I guess, step off screen now, and I'll look forward to chatting with Miriam and the rest of you in a bit.
That was great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. That was great.
Yeah.
That was really great. And you really just kept the drive going, which was what made the Coors Beer Boycott a success. It certainly made it I could say a crusade or a campaign, rather than simply one beer dump or one rally. And one of the things that happened very early is that, and it had to happen because Coors was taking such a hit on sales, they had to expand their market. And the thing is that I'm trying to find the place where I found it, but they needed to find more beer drinkers, and there weren't that many that they could find, because in the East there was already a Coors beer boycott in the Northeast, Boston, New York, the liberal cities of the Northeast were absolutely were already not selling the beer, and what were they going to do next? So I'm going to read a little bit about it. Coors tried to repair its reputation, but they began exploring cracks in communities that had been strongholds of protest. Latino civil rights groups had roused the first boycott in 1967 and had settled their discrimination lawsuit in 1977. So that goes back quite a ways. The company then hired Latino community leaders for its public relations department. It also developed a scholarship program, and the company and individual family members made donations to Latino community projects. Some groups returned the checks, and others did not. To court the gay community, Coors included sexual orientation in its non-discrimination policy in 1978. That was the first really terrible goading of gay people that was happening back in the early 70s. The lie detector tests and so on. So they made it. They put it into their non-discrimination policies, and this was the first such statement by any brewery in the company, and enough to persuade some gay bars to put Coors back on tap. It was really quite a scandal in the beer and tavern industry. San Francisco's Tavern Guild withdrew from the boycott in 1980, and in 1984, Coors made donations to AIDS charities sponsored by the Guild. And of course, 1984 was sort of the peak of the epidemic, the AIDS epidemic. It was, people were getting sick all over gay communities. And by that time, there hadn't been any really successful cures or treatments. And that changed within the next 4 or 5 years. Despite Coors' many attempts to repair its reputation, sales continued to sag. And then a scandalous speech by Bill Coors, the president of the company, triggered a more precipitous drop. Addressing Black and Latino business leaders in Denver in February 1984, he said, "The best thing they ever did for you was to drag your ancestors over here in chains." He went on to say, in Rhodesia, the economy was booming under white management. Now in Zimbabwe, under Black management, it is a disaster. It's not that dedication among Blacks is less. In fact, it's greater. They lack the intellectual capacity to succeed, and it's taking them down the tubes. So this was a speech that Bill Coors made to a Black audience about race, and it was really racist. So no national Black organization had ever formally joined the boycott, but heavy sanctions seemed imminent. Coors executives hastily negotiated an elaborate series of covenants with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. a 5-year hiring program from production jobs to middle and top management, franchise opportunities and distribution. Coors had to invite Black business people in because he had just said the most awful things, and it was a wonderful coup. Let me just get to it. The concession subject to regular audits would cost Coors $325 million. And then what happened was that the Latino organizations, their longest lived boycott opponents, agreed to a similar set of deals, again worth $325 million. And this is in the mid 1980s. It was a big hit, and he didn't make as much profits that year. Latino organizations, their longest, agreed to a similar set of deals worth $325 million, but sponsorships of Latino literacy drives and Black History Month events bought Coors neither approval nor peace. Many community groups disavowed the covenants and kept up the boycott. Now, I could read this chapter. This is my whole chapter about Coors and the beer boycott and what it meant for labor and what it meant for jobs and what they were doing. And it's all here in my book, Out in the Union, A Labor History of Queer America. And I in my book, I cover a lot of territory that's not just about the beer boycott. I kind of have a special thing with the beer boycott because it was so out there. It was so totally outrageous. And so I'd like you to ask me some questions if you have them.
Yeah, I guess we can see if others. I mean, so Miriam, I have a question for you because one of the really important things for me in research was you donated recordings of hundreds of oral history interviews to NYU.
Yes.
And I was able to listen to a lot of them.
We put them online.
Yeah, and I think I listened to them before they were online, but you know, the interviews you did with Howard Wallace were really special to me because I never was able to meet him. And you provided a lot of insight. So I'm just, maybe my question for you is, what was your experience of doing interviews like that to write your book and tell this story?
They were different people. Every interview I did was a whole adventure. I just never knew who I was going to meet. I knew Howard because he and Nancy Wohlforth, who was in the clerical. She was the chief of the Clerical Workers Union in San Francisco, and Howard and Nancy Wohlforth founded a gay coalition. Lesbian. I keep on forgetting the names of these.
LGLAN or something. Right?
What was it?
LGLAN, is that it?
That's Legland, yes.
Yeah.
Lesbian and Gay Labor Network. See. And they went around to meetings. They went around to demonstrations. They went to bars. They went to parties. And if anybody was interested in saying, I have a terrible job or I hate my boss, why aren't you in a union, would Nancy say. Mm-hmm. And they organized like that. Both of them, both Nancy and Howard. Nancy is still alive and she's among us, although she's very much retired. Howard died quite a long time ago, but they were so committed to this cause of getting gay people jobs, and then that they start unionizing as gay people, and that they come out. And you know that coming out is sort of the first step and the last step of liberation. Mm-hmm. You can't wear a mask, when you're voting. You have to say who you are. And that's what it was. It was very, very powerful. And it was in San Francisco where so many young gay people came to get away from oppressive families or to find a new self about themselves. There was a drive there, and that was a big thing, to have an organization where you could go to a meeting and talk about how glad you were not to be in the town where you grew up. And people would say, hey, yeah, I know that. Oh, yeah, I know that, those people. It became a new community. And one of the things that they did was they also worked on getting these young people jobs. So we had a lot of restaurant workers who went in there and did cooking and had romances, and it became a community. It became a real a really new kind of thing. The Castro was not just the bars; it was those great restaurants. It was the nightlife, and it was a very, very beautiful time. And it also was a time that had terrible tragedies as AIDS crept across the country, and it took a long time before we found. Well, first we found treatments. First we found ways of prevention. Those were good, but it took a long, long time before we actually found treatments that would really stop AIDS, and we lost a lot of people, and it was a very, very tragic thing. But what was so great about it was that the community was all over the neighborhood. And there were many brilliant and beautiful things that people did to comfort and help each other. It was mutual help, because some of these kids had been kicked out of their houses and they never were going to see their parents again. There were many who invited their parents to come and see them in San Francisco, and that was also a very nice thing, because it was a reunification of families. Yeah.
Thanks, Miriam. I see a couple questions in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, I figured I'd come on back in here now that we've got some questions. I just want to say it's been really a pleasure to listen to both of you talk about your research and your experiences, and talking about doing these interviews with folks, and it's really nice to be able to see kind of a really insular, like San Francisco view, as well as wider. So let's.
I just want to say one thing.
Yes.
One thing about that. Across the bay, it was dykes. Those. I mean, there were gay men in the Oakland community, and there were lesbians, of course, in San Francisco. But the scene in Oakland was dykes. Just want to say.
Nice. Well, we've got a couple of questions from folks. We have Britta Gustafson asks, I'm curious to hear how the San Francisco Tavern Guild was involved in the boycotts. I don't know if either of you can speak to that.
Yeah. Miriam, you okay if I go first?
Sure.
Okay. That's a great question, Britta. And the Tavern Guild had a really complex and rich relationship with the boycott. So Wayne Friday, who wrote for the Bay Area Reporter and I think was closely linked with the Tavern Guild, I'm trying to remember his exact relationship. He was one of the key people who helped to sort of spread the boycott in its early days in San Francisco in the early 1970s, along with Howard Wallace. All of the different taverns and bars that were part of the Tavern Guild were key places for early boycott organizing. I think Miriam also mentioned this, like Howard Wallace and others would get out of Bay Area gay liberation meetings or bagel meetings, and they'd go straight to the bars and leaflet them. And this is a quote, I think, from the interview that Miriam did with Howard, but he was like, we'd just say, hey, get rid of that shit, and
Yes.
tell them about the boycott. And then, slowly consumers would pressure bars to remove Coors and actually tell the distributor, like, we're not taking deliveries from you anymore. And so for the most part, in the 70s, the Guild was really united in supporting the boycott. But as Coors got better at negotiating with boycotters and kind of finding ways to get them to take money and say they would end the boycott, that fractured this resolve of the Tavern Guild. And one thing that I found really interesting was in the 1980s, as Miriam noted in her reading, the company had a lot of very public agreements with Black civil rights organizations or Hispanic civil rights organizations, and they called themselves Hispanic at the time, for hundreds of millions of dollars. And they tried to do something similar with the Tavern Guild. I think in 1983 or 1984, they tried to give $10,000 to the guild to pay for a health plan. I think that's what it was, to pay for a health plan. And this caused a great deal of consternation and frustration among guild members and people in the community. And I think in the end, the guild turned it down they called it a crude bribe, but later they did rescind their support for the boycott, because of the company was pretty persistent. And I think we have to be sort of honest with ourselves that in the midst of the epidemic and the crisis that brought on, and also the crisis of the far right neoliberalism and defunding of institutions in the 1980s, the money was attractive, not just for queer communities or the guild, but also to Hispanic organizations and to Black organizations. And the company knew that. And so they were really able to kind of take advantage of a political environment they helped create because of their associations with Reagan. But I think the guild its experience with the boycott kind of maps onto some of the divisions that both Miriam and I talk about in this particular boycott.
It was spectacular. The boycott was really spectacular, and it spread. And it took on, things in the Northeast. I mean, it was one thing that happened that I loved is that Boston was they were just really strict. They were orthodox. They said, get that shit out of here, and we're just not gonna, no, just take it away. And the what's the name of the Boston Red Sox? What's the name of their stadium?
Fenway Park. Yeah.
Fenway.
Yeah.
In Fenway, they just didn't serve Coors beer,
mm-hmm.
And it was a matter of it was almost a religious vow. And what happens is that the proprietor of Fenway's taverns, he told he sent his people down to New York and to all the stadiums, all the racetracks, all the sports fields. I mean, the Yankees, I'm forgetting my major league teams. Please forgive me.
The Mets, maybe.
The Mets and the Yankees would not. I mean, there was no Coors to be had in their stadiums, and it was really, really a very big deal because these are big stadiums, and this is what New Yorkers like to do in the summer, and they weren't going to get any Coors beer. There's a lot of other beers. I mean, it was a wonderful thing, and they had a hard time getting Coors. Coors had a hard time getting them back. They had to really just dump all those stupid ideas that they had about who can pull a beer nozzle that makes it bad for them if they're gay. It was really wonderful.
We have another question from Tizak Arenas that is, Miriam, you interviewed Alan Baird back in the 90s. What was your favorite moment from that interview?
The whole thing. Just the whole thing. He was such a beautiful man. And he gave me I can't remember what the drawing looked like, but he gave me a drawing that was very cute. And he just wanted to talk to me about Harvey. And he just wanted to talk with me about just how wonderful it was to fight Coors and to be with Harvey. And And it wasn't just Harvey; it was also just well, it was Howard. You know, these guys were like brothers. They were totally family. And Howard and Harvey Milk and all these guys, they were very much admired. People listened to them. You just didn't mess with them. They were union men, and they knew what to do. And it was a wonderful time, a wonderful moment. At a certain point, the pandemic took over the brotherhood in a way that it wasn't as much fun to be gay anymore, because it was really tragic at that time. I want to also say that there were a lot of women who got involved in this, because a lot of them were working in hospitals, and they were taking care of these men who were sick. And they understood what was going on, because they had certainly the nursing talent, and they understood how diseases worked. And in many, many ways, it was a reconciliation between the gay community of gay men and the lesbian community of working women, who tried to make the end of their lives not a moment and not a time of shame. You know, basically, there were so many young men in San Francisco who had basically divorced their parents, and these women helped the parents to come and deal with their sons as they were dying, and that was very, very important. So there's this very powerful spiritual thing that happened then too. It was tragic. It was important. The new medicine started working. Not everybody was. There was this whole period when people were making this patchwork, the quilt, and they were memorial. They were all memorial quilts. They were all same size. And at one rally in Washington, D.C., they blanketed the entire Washington Mall with these beautiful works of embroidery and cloth, and that it was kind of magical. There were 2 days after this rally where everybody went out, and there was no rain, and we all know I don't know if everybody knows the story of the quilt, because it was fragile, and you don't see it very often. You see pieces of it. You don't see the whole thing anymore. But that's a memory that I have that really made a lot of difference to me.
Yeah, and as Allison mentioned, and folks have mentioned in the chat, that Alan is observing tonight. So hi, Alan. I suppose we could ask Alan what his favorite moment from the interview with you was. So we've got a couple of other questions. We have Danny Nicoletta is watching this evening, and he asks, does the Coors family still fund people like the Heritage Foundation? What's going on with the Coors family now? You know, what happens post all of this?
Well, I think they'll always be loyal fascists. They just know how to hide it better, and they know how to balance it better so that they'll get into less trouble. But they are dedicated. If they leave the Coors family, that's not cool at all. It's bad. There's one. There's a gay man who is a part of the Coors family at the San Francisco Public Library, and he got them to fund, got the family to fund queer culture in the San Francisco Public Library. That was kind of nice. Not everyone is 100% terrible.
Yeah, Miriam, is it okay? I don't want to interrupt you, so
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, hi, Danny, our favorite photographer of the movement. Thank you for being here tonight, and yeah, thank you for everyone for your comments and questions. The Coors family, I think it's important to emphasize that the family has taken sort of a step away from public leadership of the company, in part to combat a boycott activity. So I think it was like in 2004, Peter Coors, the son of Bill. Yeah, it's Bill Coors' son. He ran for Senate in Colorado on a very sort of anti-gay marriage platform, and the company actually said, "Well, we don't agree with that." So we can see some distancing there, but the family does, still very devoted to their conservative causes. There's evidence that that Peter Coors and some of the other family members donated pretty extensively to the Trump campaign in 2016. So
I'm shocked.
like there's this glimmer of boycott, like a new generation of people calling to boycott Coors because of that. So they also have a number of foundations that are kind of separated from the Coors family name. The Castle Rock Foundation is the main one now, and their mission really is to fund family values Christian organizations, and they still do that pretty extensively as far as I'm aware.
You are someone who has followed this family for decades, I think now, and it's great to know how this company has been transformed by their own evil, and you've reported on it very well. And I'm looking at the title of your book, Brewing a Boycott, and it starts with something very radical and very specific and very who would boycott a beer, and because they were just so oblivious to what's ethical among people, they really were what brewed the boycott. It wasn't the activists.
Yeah.
It was really their own stupidity.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Well, take it.
Of course, like the quote you read from Bill Coors in 1984. There are a couple activists who said, in the mid 80s, we were running out of like steam on this boycott, and then all you had to do was wait for one of them to get up and say something. But I think, what did you say? Transformed by their own evil. The boycott did transform the company. They wouldn't say that's why they changed their practices, but the company is a better place than it was 50 years ago, and that's largely because of the work of these boycotters.
Oh yeah, and they were boycotting also for race minorities, and for they were really, they got things going. Not only the Coors. Well, go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I'm sort of getting a little. I'll stop for a second.
We have one other question from one of our longtime museum volunteers, Paula Lichtenberg. She asks, how available was Coors back east in the early 70s? She recalls not having any until she visited California. Was that because the boycott was already strong in the east?
No.
Or were other things going on?
No, the boycott was not a thing in the early 70s. And Coors was a California, Colorado. It was a far west organization. They had no. If you wanted to buy Coors, you'd have to go to Disneyland or something like that. It just wasn't on the market. And then you go to Disneyland. I remember this because my father did this. He wanted to bring Coors back to New Jersey. And it wasn't. It had an exotic reputation, so he bought a couple of cartons of Coors, and he brought it back to New Jersey, and he distributed among the workers in his factory. He worked in a factory in New Jersey, and they all said, "This is terrible." He said, "This is horse piss. We're never going to drink this again." They just hated it. So That's how it was not known. It had a big name, and yet when people drank it, they said this was terrible stuff. It was hard to bring it to market past the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, it's funny that you have that story, Miriam. My family did the same thing to Iowa. Yeah, so the part of the reason, Paula, why it wasn't available on the East Coast until the 1980s was because the company didn't pasteurize its beer. It was cold filtered, right? They believed that the pasteurization process was bad for the beer, and so they didn't distribute east of the Mississippi because it was logistically too difficult. But then because of the impact of the boycott, they started to expand their distribution in the 80s, and they also opened up a new facility on the East Coast. So really, I think it's like 1981, 1982, they start pushing into the East Coast. But a lot of people in New York or Boston, like even before the beer got there, they had done the groundwork. So they would mail requests to Dave Sickler or Howard and say, hey, send us 100 buttons and bumper stickers. We want to be ready. And so it was really difficult for Coors to push into those markets because the movement had, laid this foundation that really just automatically started boycotting.
Well, I remember when they first came to New York City, the Lesbian Gay Labor Network organized a beer dump at a bar that did sell Coors, and they just went in there and they said, we're gonna throw out all your beer, and the bar proprietor said, go ahead, no one's buying it. So they had a ceremony. There was a sewer outside the tavern, and it was right near NYU, so everybody likes to throw beer in down the sewer at NYU. It's one of the things they do, and it was quite a little scene. It was really funny, and it was one of those show things that they did with the Lesbian and Gay Labor Network to get people interested in that we do fun things like throw beer down the dump, down the sewer. If we want to have activism, if we really want to have things happening, we have to go out there and do things that are out there. That's the name of the game. All of us have come out in some way or another that we never thought we would do that, and then we did. So it's good to be brave.
I think that's a really nice place to kind of wrap things up on. Is it's good to be brave. It took a lot of courage for folks in these various coalitions to take on such a corporate giant, and make big waves of change. And I think that's a really wonderful ethos to kind of move forward in. And Britta mentions in the comments, like, what would it take to put together such robust boycott efforts nowadays, looking at such a different world in, I was about to say 2021, but we're in 2022. I figured, that might be a good kind of last question to cap us off for the night. But just speaking from your own experience and your own history with looking into these, movements and these actions, what are your own opinions on what do you think it would take to bring us into the era of, being able to do a boycott at this level that has such a similar impact in 2022 world?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this question a lot, and one thing I like to consider is that the boycott is like this really flexible tactic that activists can use, and corporations have tried to assault the boycott and make it illegal and make it something that you can't do because it scares them. And so I think the boycott as a tool has the potential to be still very effective. And yeah, Uline, right, which is, I think, connected to the family that originally owned the Miller Brewing Company. So there's an interesting connection there, Britta. But I don't know exactly what it would take to put together a truly successful boycott, but I think some ingredients have to include real reciprocal solidarity. If you want to build a big boycott, you need to, as Alan Baird and Howard Wallace learned, you can't just say, oh yeah, we're all like doing this boycott and not really do anything. Like, do things for each other and do actions like dump outs. I think a boycott can kind of feel like a passive thing, and the Coors boycott shows that it should not be passive. It should be active. It should be solidarity driven. It should be something that makes you feel like you're part of something and you're wearing the button and you've got the bumper sticker on the back of your car. And yeah. Rowdy, right? And I think it also just takes good messaging. And the Coors boycott was partially successful because the name on the can was the same as the name of the family. And so it's easy to remind consumers over and over again what was going on there. But what do you think, Miriam?
I think that you have to go past your comfort level to really get people to pay attention. And that takes them past their comfort levels. And that way, that's how we organize in little steps that create a movement.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your insight and your years of experience and research. We're going to close up here this evening, and I just want to encourage everyone that you can purchase and read both Brewing a Boycott and Out in the Union on the GLBT Historical Society's bookshop.org page. We have our own little bookshop on there. You can support fellow independent booksellers as well as us. We get a couple of cents for every book purchased on our bookshop.org page, whether it's one of the books that we recommend on our lists, or if you just want to get some fun books for yourself and for your friends and family members. And Allison has so wonderfully offered that folks can request a personalized book plate. We're now in the world of virtual book talks, virtual book signings. So this is our best way to figure out how to do a signing. But you can go to Allison's website here, AllisonBrantley.com/request a book plate with dashes in between, and you can request a book plate for your copy of Brewing a Boycott. And we've got a couple of folks that are just saying in the comments, great job, wonderful, solidarity from Local 223 from Tizak. It's really wonderful that so many wonderful Teamsters and union members have joined us for this evening. And I want to thank the both of you. Is there anything that either of you would like to kind of shout out or mention before we kind of wrap up for the evening?
I mean, thank you so much, Lee, for coordinating this. This was really fun. One thing I just want to say, I think a couple people have requested book plates recently, and the website got like bombarded by bots. So I'm just trying to. They are coming to you. They're just a little bit delayed because I had to sort out who is real and not real.
Bots.
Yeah. I didn't expect. I was like, wow, there's like thousands of people who want one of these. Anyway, yes, I would love to send you something that's signed and it has a little image of the fists from the cover of the book on it, and you can stick it on the front page of your book. So, but thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much, Miriam, for all of you.
I love this.
This was joining us tonight. It's just been really great. So
yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone who's been watching and putting their comments and observations in the chat. We got some really wonderful stories from folks. And if you enjoyed this program and you are interested in checking out more, we do more programs. We do our programs on a quarterly basis. We schedule them out. Our next program is going to be February 4th. We have a conversation that's part of our Curiosity Corner series, which is kind of like a show and tell of our archives. And so we're going to be having our project archivist, Megan Needles, and our reference archivist, Isaac Fellman, chatting with our curatorial specialist and museum registrar, Ramon Silvestre, about some of the kind of hidden gems from the vault, some of our kind of favorite off-brand kind of wacky things that you would not expect to find in an archive, which is one of the things that makes our work so unique. So I encourage everyone to check that out and check out more of our programs. You can check things out at glbthistory.org/events. And I'm gonna close this out this evening with just a little slideshow that'll be playing where you can see more about programs and where to find us online. And we'll also be putting up a little link for our public programs feedback survey. We love hearing feedback from folks. What you liked about the programs, what you like about our series, what you're looking forward to. And so we'll put that up there, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much, Allison and Miriam. And thank you everyone who has tuned in this evening, and have a wonderful and safe weekend. Bye.